Wonderful. So with that being said, I will pass over to my wonderful co-host Maddie, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
So hi everyone, thank you for coming. So our first speaker is Shannon. Shannon is a final year PhD psychology student, and her talk will explore the joys and challenges of testing parents and their preschool age children online, whilst outlining the steps we can take to maintain the quality of our research practices. So yeah, just when you're ready, Shannon.
Lovely, thanks. So hi everyone. This is my first virtual presentation, so bear with me. But basically, I'm just going to talk to you, like Maddie said, about the joys and the challenges of testing preschool age children online. So I'll just start sharing now. So hopefully you can see this. Yeah, so it's basically, we've been doing this for about a year now, near enough, which is really frightening. But today's talk is just going to be covering what we've done, how we've done it, and some of the pros and cons of working this way. So just for a little bit of context, before the pandemic, I used to go into families' houses and see preschool age children, so 3 to 4-year-olds and their parents at home. I would take equipment with me that the children would play with, and I'd also take a camera and a microphone and things like that. But I would be going between participants' houses, so I'd be going from one house to the next, sometimes 2 or 3 families in a day. So in a situation like coronavirus, that's very high risk and just not feasible. But before coronavirus, it was already a little bit challenging because there was a lot of time constraints in the sense that I had to factor in going to and from participants' houses. It cost, so I would travel in my own car, so there was travel costs associated with that. And I'd also have to oftentimes rope in other researchers to come with me, whether that's PhD students or undergraduates to come with me, so that I wasn't going into these houses on my own. Whereas now we do it all over Zoom, and I'm in the comfort of my own home, and so are the participants. It's incredibly low risk. There is no contact anymore apart from virtual contact. It's less time consuming, and it's, in my opinion, a little bit better, but we'll get into that. So I've had to take every facet of my research online, and that's included recruitment. So before I used to go to places like Sure Start centres and nurseries and preschools. Now I use things like Facebook. So we have community groups and nursery groups that I infiltrate, and I go in and I talk about my research on there and garner interest that way. I used to go to more casual settings like coffee shops, and now I do that by using things like Twitter and Instagram. So I use hashtags and keywords to find the kind of people that I used to find in coffee shops. Another thing that I used to do was print out flyers, and my environmentalist heart was very upset about that because there's a lot of paper involved. So now we do something slightly different, and I put everything that I need for my participants online. So the information sheet is now online, the whole flyer is now online, including a recruitment video. So everything that the participant would need to want to get involved is all available online. That was a little challenging to begin with because I've never made a website before, but once it was up, it's been quite useful. So what we got our participants to do was to read a book, have a snack, and play with Lego, and that was when I was in their houses. So when we moved this online, we decided that it just wasn't possible to send out equipment to people, so instead we opted for something that every family would have in their house. So we switched the playing with Lego to drawing together, because most families will have pens or pencils and paper at home. But everything else has stayed the same, so that's been really good because we've got comparable data now, at least we will once I've finished testing. So these are the things that I've found from testing children online. And it's very much the same as testing children face to face, but now we just really have to emphasize these points. So you have to be varied, you have to have a lot of different tasks. So here, for example, I have false belief tasks, I have drawing, and I have reading a book, and then also things like pointing to the screen to get their answers. You have to be engaging, so you have to make sure that the child is actively involved in what they're doing. But you also have to be incredibly flexible. So sometimes children's moods change on a dime. And that's obviously the same face-to-face as it would be online, but with online, they can just get up and leave if they want to. Off they go. You can't coax them back with stickers or anything like that. So you do have to be really flexible, and you have to change what you're doing really quickly. So you have high level activities like getting up and moving, and then quieter, calmer activities like drawing or reading a book. So another thing that I've said that is ideal to be doing is to make it amusing. So this isn't necessarily as important for older participants, but for children, make it fun, game-like and jovial, and they're more likely to get involved. And then the final thing is to be brief. If you're getting a child to stay on a call for too long, they're going to flag, they're not really interested. And like I said, all of these things are stuff that we do as child researchers face-to-face, but I just think these points are really important when we're doing it online as well. And so yeah, the acronym is BFAB. So to be fab, you've got to be fab, and that's how I've tried to remember it. So the thing that's really changed between being online and being face-to-face is now we have to enlist parents as proxy researchers. So I ask participants, the children, to point to things on the screen, and it's very, very difficult or near impossible to know exactly what it is they're pointing at the screen. So this is where I get parents involved and ask them to tell me what it is that the child is pointing at. And initially when I started doing this, I was really worried that parents might lie and say that their child were getting all of the answers correct. And I was very worried that it might be a bit like, oh yeah, he got every single answer right there. So then you lose the individual differences and you lose the variation in the sorts of results that you're looking for. So the way that we've got around that is by basically emphasising the importance of seeing differences between children and reframing how we're looking at these tests so that they're not tests, they're not something that you can make a mistake on realistically, they're just looking at differences between children. And again, the other important thing is to manage the expectations of the parents. So tell them that we are expecting children to get things wrong on these tasks, and actually we're really interested in when they do. We really care about those sorts of mistakes. So just looking at mistakes as opportunities to see how and when children learn things. And actually looking at the data just anecdotally, it does seem that we're still getting individual variation online as we would expect face-to-face. So some of the benefits of online testing, in summary, is that we can get more participants from a wider variety of places. So there is no travel involved anymore, so we can get people right across the country. So my research is based mostly in this country, but I know that Laura's going to talk about things cross-culturally, so that's really interesting. That's something that we can do using remote testing. And with that, there's reduced time and cost because we're not traveling to participants anymore. We're sat at home in our offices, and yeah, all we have to do is click on a Zoom link and then we're there with the participants. And then because of those things, we are able to test more people in a shorter time frame, so that increases our opportunity to make larger scale studies more feasible. The flip side of this is some of the costs to online testing. So one of the things that is really playing on my mind quite a bit is the fact that we might be reducing the representation of our socioeconomic status of our participants. So the prerequisites of being able to test online mean that you need a device to test on. So you need something that the phone to zoom to, and then you need a stable internet connection. Those things might preclude certain people from taking part, and that's something just to bear in mind. And so something that I think Matt's going to touch on later on is the control that we have in the environment of the participants. So we can't really control what our participant environment looks like. We can ask them to turn the television off or make sure that if there are any other children in the home, they're cared for. But there are still things that might crop up that makes it a less distraction sterile environment. And then the final thing is just an initial rapport that before would come from meeting people face-to-face in coffee shops or in nurseries. You don't have that anymore. So you have to work super hard the first time you see these people to make them feel comfortable and to build that trust. But you can do that really easily by using BFAB, I think. It's worked so far. So some of the things that I wanted to discuss a little bit more, and perhaps these are things that we can talk about a little later, is how likely is it that these practices will continue post-COVID? So are there benefits to doing this online that stretch beyond just infection control? And then also the other thing is how do we quantify and combat the lost participants that we're losing potentially by moving stuff online? So the people that don't have a stable internet connection, the people that don't have access to devices that we can test them on, how do we get around that? And that's the gist of it, I guess. There was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and there are more things that I'd like to talk about, but not today, I guess. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was really, really interesting. So now we do actually have 5 minutes if anyone does have any questions for Shannon. If not, we can go back to her discussion points, but I can see some raised hands. I'm not sure if they're raised hands or claps, actually. Sorry, am I blind? They're claps. I do apologise, Shannon, you're getting clapped.
Thank you.
But I am not sure if anyone does have any questions for Shannon. You are welcome to either type them in the chat box and I can read them to her, or if you're brave enough, unmute yourself and talk to yourself.
Right. If you don't mind, my name is Callie. I'm doing a postgraduate in environmental health. So I'm not in research. I did research in the past, yet again. All I wanted to ask Shannon is, will you be able to compare your results to people who interviewed children face-to-face in the past and see if the reactions were similar or anything along these lines, to see if the virtual environment had any impact on your research? That's all I'm asking. Thank you.
That's a fantastic question, and actually it is something that I'm planning on doing. So what's really nice about the way that we've been able to work with testing online is that I've been able to do exactly the same test that I used to do face-to-face with participants. So I used to get parents and children to read a book together, I used to get them to have a snack together, and I used to get them to play together. And now I'm doing this online. I do think that I have comparable research between the two to be able to make some sort of comparison and see whether what we're getting online is in any way valid data compared to face-to-face. So that is in the pipeline, and it is something that I would like to work with in the future. Thank you for that question. Oh, Laura, I think you're muted, sorry.
That would be a good place to start, wouldn't it? Thank you, Shannon. I can see that you've got a question in the chat box from Jennifer saying, what preference do you have in regards to maintaining these methods post-COVID, or would you consider doing some mixed methods in the future?
Again, that's a fantastic question. And actually, I think that online testing definitely does have a place in the future, in my mind at least, because there are environmental factors to consider. We do have to consider our environmental footprint when we're testing. And I don't necessarily think that if we find that the data is comparable, I don't necessarily think there are many inherent benefits in traveling across the country when we can use technology to connect with families. But then there are other things to consider, like the fact that we might be losing certain people. So I definitely think a mixed approach, if we can find that these two things are comparable and work hand in hand, it would be fantastic, because it would mean that we can access the people that we might be losing online, but also that we can reduce our costs and things like that when it comes to getting larger samples.
Thank you. And just to quickly say, I can see that Sarah has put a comment in our chat box that Shannon is correct. We can talk about how this is domestic research that Shannon's talking about, but we also are working on online methods internationally. So I'm not going to be talking about my international research in this seminar. We're focusing on domestic research, but we are planning an overseas version of this exact seminar, which the date is to be confirmed, and you'll definitely see us advertising that. But we have got some resources that we can direct you to in the meantime about how to do that international research. So that is coming, just not in today's session. I can see you've got another couple of comments here. Should have worn my glasses, I'm sorry, from Joe saying, thank you for the great talk, Shannon. Would you mind saying a bit more about how the process of the call goes, please? Talking to the parents first, giving info and getting consent. And then sadly, after that comment, we'll have to move on to our next speaker.
Yeah, fantastic. So this is a really good point. So the initial screening questions that we have for participants, so just to make sure that this study is right, then that happens on my website. So it means that it reduces my workload in the sense that I don't have to field multiple questions from people, because all of the information's there online, and they use a Qualtrics questionnaire to screen themselves out of the process. Once they've got past that, they then are able to book in online, which sends me a notification to say that they've expressed interest and they've chosen a date. And then I'm able to then send them the information sheet and set up a phone call with them where I talk to them about everything that's in the information sheet, so there's not a heavy reading load for them. I just talk to them about what to expect. And then from that, I set up a Zoom call on a date that suits them, and we go from there. So consent is given in 3 different places. So written consent over email. They also consent on the Qualtrics questionnaire that I send them, which is a separate questionnaire that collects demographic information. And then we also have a verbal consent as well, again, before I start recording them on Zoom. So there's 3 levels of consent, which were similar to what we would do before face-to-face. I just consult with them again when I get to their home and just say, are you happy for this to go ahead? So yeah, that's the basic structure. I hope I've answered that clearly. Sorry.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm sure everyone will join me in giving you a virtual round of applause. That was absolutely fantastic. Yes, thank you. Before we now move on to our second speaker, which is Matt. So to give Matt an introduction to his fantastic talk, Matt is a final year sport, exercise and rehabilitation PhD student. Matt's talk will address the pros and cons of transitioning lab-based experimental research into online research.
Thank you. Let me just share screen and get this on. Can everyone see that? Perfect. So yeah, thank you very much for the intro. I'm just going to talk about some of my experiences and the pros and cons of conducting online research versus lab-based. So firstly, just a little bit about me. As was said, I'm a third-year PhD student based in sport, exercise and rehabilitation sciences. And my research focus really is on kind of the neural control of movement, how the brain controls and adapts movement, with specific focuses on aging and non-invasive brain stimulation. So normally this is kind of what my research looks like. We have 1 to 2 hour sessions, putting electrodes near or on the head for long periods of time, which is obviously not COVID compliant. So that was kind of one of the main reasons we looked to transition online. And when I talk about online research, what really that means to me is collecting behavioral data, but using an online platform. And one of the questions is kind of why to move online? And this may be lots of different reasons for lots of different people. For me, it was a kind of a culmination of different things. Which mainly involved just trying to keep progressing through the PhD, especially in that mid-second to third year phase, and wanting to collect new data and still kind of understand new things rather than kind of write a new review article. And also, when we look at the field as a whole, it seemed to be where people were heading in terms of they were also looking to transition online. And there was a community out there to be able to understand how you can get through the different hurdles in place. And to that end, Brainbox Limited have a really good YouTube webinar that they've put on where they've discussed a lab in, I think it was in Manchester, who've progressed online. And if people are interested in that, then it'll be good for them to see. So a little bit my experiment and how that kind of fits into online research. So what we did was we developed a simple kind of visual motor adaptation task, which involves people using their mouse or their trackpad, which controls an on-screen cursor, and they direct that to visual targets that appear on their screen. And then we alter the relationship between their aimed movement and the visual feedback, which gives us really nice learning curves, which we can then analyze. And in our task, we were interested in motor planning. So we wanted to record accurate reaction times within that. And here's just a little animation of kind of what the task is. So people make a forward movement and the green cursor moves towards the target. Then at some point during the task, they make a movement and we've altered that relationship. So the cursor now flies off in a direction they don't expect. And after loads and loads of trials, people learn to adapt their movements and therefore they can direct their movement in a different direction to get the cursor accurate. And this kind of does produce really nice reproducible learning curves that we can then analyze for lots of different things. And kind of onto the main topic of this is what I've found, just a handful of things that I found to be really useful in terms of online research. And I think it's interesting that there's been some crossover from what Shannon mentioned as well in a completely different field. So firstly is that I've actually been able to collect data, which I think a lot of people haven't, and that's really sad, but we've been able to collect really nice behavioral data that is definitely going to be usable in a thesis and then also potentially a publication after that. So I think that's been like the massive pro of making that decision to move online. participant recruitment, I think Shannon touched upon this, but also it's a really, really good way to increase your N of studies. So you can post a link to your study, which is how this study was ran. You can put it on Twitter or crowdsurfing websites, and therefore you've got a lot of opportunity to reach lots of different people. And again, that means you can reach different demographics, whether that's international, older adults, younger adults, that kind of increased capability to get much more people knowing about your study and then also involved as well. Time saving. So obviously my studies generally last 1 to 2 hours, and that involves being in a lab with each of the participants. And then you also have to factor in other people in your lab group who may want access to the lab as well. With an online study, you can send out that link with all the information, and you could have 10 people doing it at the exact same time, which means it frees up a lot of your time to be doing other things, whether that's analysis or writing or focusing on other projects. So I think that's been a really big plus to doing a study online, being able to collect 200 participants worth of data in just a couple of months. One thing that participants have said is that they've really enjoyed the flexibility, so that they're able to do the task in their own schedule. They don't have to fit it in with you. They don't have to travel to come to the lab and make time around their working schedule, which has kind of contributed to why we can get more people involved, which has been really good as well to make the participants feel more comfortable, which again just means that you can access more people, which is really useful. And then one thing that I'm kind of finding now coming to the end of the first study is that once you've got that platform there ready and already set up, it seems quite easy to go back to kind of experimental builders and edit things and progress your research ideas through to new studies. And then just to the cons, and obviously there's going to be difficulties with running any kind of study, whether it's in the lab or it's online. So these are just a few things that I think have found a little bit difficult, but then also some solutions to how you might get around them. So firstly, you just have so much less experimental control with an online study, especially in terms of how we've run it. So you have that link and you send out the instructions, and then it's really up to the participant to follow that and go from there. Whereas if you had a lab-based study, generally you can make sure every stage the participant is really understanding of what the instructions are. So you have communication between the experiment and the participant does become much more difficult in this sense. And therefore you have to make the instructions really, really crystal clear so they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing to achieve task success. Which also kind of factors into the amount of data that comes through that you can just tell people haven't read the instructions, they don't know what they're doing. A lot of participants kind of quit midway through because they get bored. So you find a lot of the data comes through either missing large chunks or just really haven't followed what they were supposed to be doing, which is useful that you can get a lot more people involved, which kind of mitigates those unusable data sets. But that's something that I found compared to a lab-based task has been a lot more. So in terms of what we ran, there seems to be a large number of confounds, and especially that can relate to the different devices people use, the different internet speeds and internet browsers, and things like frame rate and refresh rate can result in differences in data that can be quite small, but also it might just be something you have to think about when you come to analyze your data, whether you want to access that information to show. So we've done things like analyzing whether people use a mouse or a trackpad to see if it differences in their kinematics of their reaches. And then technical difficulties, which seems like you're going to find technical difficulties with any study you run. But in terms of an online research, it's more so that because you don't have that really easy channel of communication, you don't quite understand what the participant might have done to cause that difficulty. You don't quite know if it's something on your end or something on their end. So it does become a little bit more difficult to fix exactly what the problem is or just find what it is in the first place. So that can just be a little bit of a problem going forward as well. And then two more things that I think, again, Shannon mentioned, you've got to think about, is your kind of population, your participant demographic going to be able to have access and have the kind of tech know-how to be able to do these studies? So like I was talking about potentially being focused on aging, and I know a lot of older adults are really, really great with computers and things like this, but it might be not as able to do these things if your task is more complex. And then obviously study designs might have to be simplified in terms of you're not going to be able to use your imaging and stimulation and recording techniques. And also if your study is really complex, it's going to be difficult to make those instructions crystal clear. But I think some of the best studies are some of the most simple studies, so it might actually turn out to be a benefit in the end. And then just to kind of conclude after finishing my kind of first online study, what are my overall thoughts? And I think in terms of just progressing through a PhD and feeling confident that I've actually achieved something kind of material during this year has been a really, really huge benefit. Obviously, there's going to be lots of challenges. And again, that's the same with any research. But I think if you can overcome those, the rewards of doing online studies can be just as great as a lab-based study. And then I get a few questions talking about, well, is the data the same? Is it as reliable as an online study? And I think there's been some research come out recently comparing directly the two, and it's something that we would look to do as well. So the simple answer, I think, is yes. I think obviously in your limitations section, you're going to discuss what online versus lab-based might mean to the data, but I think there's enough research out there to suggest that actually this data is usable and reliable. So I just want to say a massive thank you to all my supervisors, particularly John, I think is here, who is a programming whiz and helped out so much on that end, and then all my affiliations and funders. And then I'll leave any questions, and just to kind of spurn the discussion, thinking about maybe what platform you want to use to push your experiment online, what ethical considerations you might have to think about in terms of gathering online consent, and then also with potential human research restarting soon with the lifting of lockdown, should you start an experiment now or hold off for starting human research again?
Thank you, Matt. So once again, I think everyone will join me in giving you a virtual round of applause. That was really, really useful, especially with some of the complex methodologies that you're dealing with. So I'm sure anyone who's dealing with similar areas will have really, really appreciated that talk. Exactly the same as before. I'm happy to have people unmute and ask their questions directly, or alternatively, if you'd rather put them in the chat box again, I can read them. Is someone unmuted? Sorry, I can see a hand. Michael, yeah?
Yeah. Hi, thanks for the great talk. So I noticed, just like Shannon, you mentioned that you dealt with recruitment through social media. Did you consider any kind of participant recruitment resources like Prolific?
My main way of doing it was kind of outreach to family and friends mainly, and then kind of social media was a secondary, just because I think I have a lot of people that I can ask favors from, and we had an undergraduate project student group also. We wanted to give them an opportunity to collect data, so they also helped with that using friends and family. I know of people that have used things like that, especially I think in Canada and the States, have used these crowdsourcing kind of recruitment methods, which I think you can gather a lot more. Some of the difficulty with this study is the way we set up. We had loads of different groups, and therefore we had to send out lots of different codes that specifically which specifically were determined by a different group. So if we potentially had one link that we could send out, I think that would be a great way to you could therefore reach ends of kind of, we've got studies in the literature that have had thousands of participants by using those kind of crowdsourcing and participant recruitment websites. So I think it's definitely something that people could look to use, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Has anybody got any further questions for Matt? Oh, I can see a question in the chat. So does your project have to do with motor skills and aging?
So previous research that I've done, we've had older adults, 65 to 85-year-olds, come into the lab and conduct similar experiments. So far with the study that we ran online, we had just young adults, and that was written into our ethics originally as well. So far we haven't looked to transition this online. It's something that I think I might simplify the study slightly and look to do that, especially with my funding being aging focused. So it's something that I would be looking to do. And I know other people in my lab group have run some online studies with Parkinson's disease patients, looking at similar motor skill tasks, and they've had some success there as well. So I think it's definitely doable. You just potentially have to think about how things might need to be adapted in order for older adults to be comfortable doing it, because I know a lot of people say they've had opportunity to do online studies in the past where they didn't have to, but they much rather coming into the lab for the rapport you get with the researcher as well, because if they're going to spend their time doing it, they like to actually know exactly what they're doing and what they're participating in. But I think it is definitely an avenue that can be explored.
Thank you. And I can see that Callie is saying thank you for your response. We've got a question from Nadia now, which will have to be the final question in this part of the discussion for Matt. If you have any other questions for Matt, though, please do continue to message him privately. I know that he's happy to answer questions privately. But from Nadia, we've got, do you offer a reward or compensation for your participants?
So again, in the past, that's something we have done. We've offered travel expenses or pro rata kind of compensation, so £7.50 an hour for coming in and doing the study. With this one, we didn't, because normally we use petty cash and various Amazon vouchers and things. So that's generally, we just hand them over after the session. But it's something that you can, because obviously over email you can send kind of Amazon vouchers and things like that. So it's something you can do. This study we didn't, because we needed 180 participants around that number, and I don't think my funding would cover the expenses to give people a reward or compensation after each one. So it was very much volunteer, and we let them know at the very beginning that they wouldn't be receiving any remuneration for doing it.
Thank you, Matt. And I can see that Nadia's thanked you as well for that wonderful answer. So I suppose that makes it my turn. Maddie, do you want to just unmute yourself?
Thank you, Matt. That was really informative. So next we have Laura Stevens. So Laura is a first-year psychology PhD student, and her talk will discuss the design considerations for moving replication studies online, including both the challenges and how we intend to overcome them to measure the same constructs online. So yeah, take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Can you see my screen okay? Is that all right?
Yeah, looks good.
Wonderful, thank you. So just a super quick overview of what I'm going to cover, a little bit of background about me and the replication study that I'm currently trying to design, and then my approach to actually tackling a replication of a previously in-person study, moving it online for replication, and then I'll summarise the key ideas that I have found really important in this process before offering again some opportunity for questions and discussion. So about me then, I am a first year PhD student, as Maddie's just said. So I am coming at this from a slightly different perspective to the rest of the speakers today, where I haven't actually collected my data yet. I am still in the design stages. So everything that I'm talking with you about is what I'm currently going through about choosing to design my study, even as we're coming out of COVID, to make sure that I have got a good study that I can do in the meantime. So I am an eyewitness memory researcher. So I am looking at how can we use basic memory principles to use in investigative interviews, in particular with survivors of sexual violence. So the first experiment in my PhD is a replication of Eberson and Reinick 1998. So in this original study, they had people come into the lab in pairs. They were strangers. They would read each other a story, and they would later have to recall both the story and the individual that they were partnered with. So that is what I'm trying to replicate, but just using online measures. And I'm also adding in a misinformation effect. So my overall approach to completing this replication, but online, to make it slightly more manageable for myself, I've chosen to break the study into segments. So the segments that you saw on my contents page, just so as I could tackle each particular area separately to make it slightly more manageable and a little less daunting. For each individual aspect, I would think about what can be done the same if it was lab versus online versus what needs to change, because it's the elements that need to change that will require a little bit more focus and attention. So my overall design and the conditions that I'm going to be putting people into, can this stay the same online as if it was conducted in the lab? For me, the answer to this is yes. My groups would be exactly the same if I was bringing them into the lab versus using online research. So this isn't an element I've had to focus on all too much. Participants, though, this had a few similarities and a few differences. So overall, Eberson and Reinick collected 30 participants per condition, and for me to have enough power for analysis, I'm going to need to collect the same amount just using online methods. So I know we've already been spoken to today about dropouts and missing data and things like that. But because I am actually using a repeated retention interval and people are going to have to come back multiple times, I would probably see attrition in my groups, whether it was in online research or whether it was lab-based research. I would likely see attrition. So I'm prepared for dropout, whether I'm in lab or whether I'm online. As well as the demographic in Eberson and Reinick's study, they had an average age of around about 25. So I will actually be collecting data using the Birmingham Sonar system or Prolific. So I am using Prolific for my particular experiment because I have very kindly been given a little bit of funding to use that and to give people some compensation for it. So roughly the kind of demographic that I'm going to collect is probably going to be similar to the original study. And what needs to be different though with moving from this lab-based study to be online, my recruitment and my inclusion criteria are going to be slightly different. Eberson and Reinick were able to use opportunity sampling with people that they could meet, whereas I'm going to have to advertise for volunteers online. And for my inclusion criteria, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I need my participants to read a story to each other, which means they're going to have either a printer to print it out or a second screen so they can be on Zoom with me as well as reading this story. So they'll need a second screen or a printer. Whereas if they were in lab, I would obviously be able to print it and give it to them. So for those types of reasons, my inclusion criteria is going to be a little bit more difficult than if I was to do it in the lab. My variables and measures that I am using. Can my variables stay the same as if I was conducting it in the lab? For me, most of my variables, like reading somebody a story and getting them to recall it later, they're very Zoom friendly. That's absolutely fine. But one variable that Eberson and Reinick used was they asked people to estimate their partner's height and weight, the stranger in the scenario with them. That's going to be a bit difficult just staring at somebody with their head and shoulders. So instead, I'm having to adapt that variable just to have a very generic representation of someone's build or physique, because I can't get height and weight estimates. But for most of my variables, they can stay very much the same. Can I measure my variables the same way as I would in the lab? For the most part, very similar to Matt, I am going to change the original measurement. Originally, Eberson and Reinick were able to phone all of their participants and ask them verbally for their recall. But because of how many conditions I am running and getting 180 participants to recall at multiple time points, that was going to be very difficult for me to Zoom each of these individuals 3 to 4 times. So I am actually going to use an online recall method. So they're going to be collecting these variables independently. I'm not going to be present. One positive of that is that it limits some of the investigator effects. So I can't give them any hints in the way that I'm asking questions. But obviously a negative that comes with that is that I'm not able to clarify anything for them. So if they don't understand any of the questions that I'm posing, I can't clarify it. So I need to make sure my questions are super, super clear. The overall procedure, what similarities will I have from Eberson and Reinick to my online version? The task of giving people a story is going to remain very much the same. The only difference is that it will be over Zoom rather than in a public place. What is another difference is it's going to be far more technical, that if I was to get people to come and meet in a lab room, that would be a lot easier than getting them both on Zoom and trying to encourage everybody to have less distractions and things like that. But what I can do on Zoom is if I turn my video off, because I don't want them to encode me, I want them to only encode their partner in the Zoom call. If I turn my video off, I can remove myself from the screen and they can just see each other in the largest capacity on their screen. So that is good, but it does mean that it's slightly more technical than just bringing them into a lab. As I mentioned earlier, and I know some of the other speakers have mentioned, it's going to rely very much on my instructions. My instructions need to be really, really clear so people can understand them. And finally, my manipulation checks. I will need to check that the manipulations, such as my misinformation effect, are actually being attended to and incorporated. So for things like this, when I'm giving them the misinformation, I am going to have separate screens that also have an attention task where I am double checking, are they actually paying attention versus just clicking through the procedure. Finally, then, I'm also considering the ethics that are becoming part of this replication study. So something that I thought was quite key for me was consent. I know this has been mentioned previously today, but because I am working with partners, what I didn't want was to be asking them when both partners are on the screen for their consent. So I am going to send them their consent forms prior to them taking part in the study, get them to read through it and fully decide, do they consent before coming to the Zoom session, especially because, as I said, a lot of my work is to do with sexual violence. So I want to make sure they understand that. I need to make sure that they understand how to withdraw from an online setting. So things like leaving the Zoom call, sending me an email with their participant code, things like that. And due to the nature of my study, I do need to make sure that my debrief has super clear signposting to services for sexual violence. So finally then, what are the key ideas I've just covered? Break things down so as they're in separate parts, so as it's a little bit more manageable for you. Consider what you can keep the same and what needs to be different, so you know what your focus should be. Super clear instructions and manipulation checks, and to make sure that they are clear and working, do lots and lots of trial runs. I do have some questions for discussion and my contact details if anybody needs it. So that is the end of my presentation. I can come back to my discussion if needs be. So thank you very much. I can see that we have some more questions, but I can see that they were to Matt, so that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Matt, for answering those while I was talking. So I do actually have some time now if anybody does have any questions for me. Exactly the same. I can either read them from the chat, or if you'd like to unmute, I can answer them.
Laura, I have a question.
Hello, Julie.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the fabulous talk. And I think it's really impressive how all the speakers so far have managed to switch from lab-based research to online research so quickly. So I think that's really an achievement during your PhD.
Thank you so much.
So I was just wondering, in terms of manipulation checks, you mentioned that you have included them to make sure that they were actually paying attention. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've included and how you've done that? Especially for an eyewitness task, that's very important where you're testing memory.
Yes, yeah. So the key thing that we're considering at the moment is for my misinformation, I obviously need to make sure that they are paying attention to, it will come in the form of a second story. So for the story that they've heard, I'm then going to tell them basically somebody else's recall of that story as the misinformation. And what I'm going to do with that is I will have it on separate screens so they can't just read a block of text on one screen. To make sure they're actually attending to it, I'm going to have it as an audio as well. So I'm trying to force them to pay attention. So it's going to be audio as well as reading. And they won't be allowed to click through to the next segment until after a period of time has passed, so 20 seconds. Again, trying to force them to actually read and listen to what's on the screen. But in terms of making sure that they have paid attention, it will be things like in between screens when they've pressed on, it will be a short question like something along the lines of press 888 before moving on, which I know seems a little bit pedantic, but it's just to double check that they're not literally just going next, 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 next. Because if they're not able to fill in that detail, it's showing that they're not actually attending to what's on the screen, so I can remove them. So that's what I'm doing for my misinformation effect, as well as I am going to pilot it a little bit. So to double check that, is my misinformation effect actually coming through? If it's not, to obviously go back to the drawing board and check, why is this not working online? So I hope that answered your question, Julie.
Yeah, thank you, Laura.
Thank you. If there isn't any more questions for me, then we will move on to our final speaker. Oh, I can see one. So do these partners need to stay together till the end of the study? No, they only stay together in the encoding phase. So when they come together on Zoom and they read each other a story and they encode what the other person looks like in their little Zoom portal. So they stay together in the encoding portion of the study, but for recall, they will do that separately, independently. Thank you, Callie. Thank you very much. So with that being said, I can now introduce our wonderful final speaker, which is Maddie. She is a master's student with us. She's a master's by research psychology student, and her talk will explore the ethical and practical implications of online research with children, such as engagement, data security, and the use of software platforms. So thank you, Maddie, take us away.
Thanks, Laura. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Bear with me 2 seconds. Oh, sorry, guys. Sorry, it's a bit of a complicated setup. Right, can everyone see that okay? Laura?
You're perfect. Sorry, I was thumbsing you.
Yay, sorry. I thought I'd lost Zoom for a minute.
No,
Awesome.
Not dropped out. Off you go.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. Thanks for coming, everybody. So my name's Maddie, and I'm doing a Master's by Research in Psychology. So just a super brief overview of the project and context. So we're investigating which metacognitive measures are predictive accuracy in children. So for example, how predictive confidence judgments and various body language are of accuracy. So our task involved a 2 alternate forced choice task after encoding a complex memory event. We'd originally planned to recruit and test in schools, with the children completing the experiment on a tablet with an experimenter. So as you can see here, when shifting the experiment online, we kept the aim and the method the same, but we had to make changes to the recruitment sample. So we anticipated recruitment being harder online, so we decided to recruit children aged 4 to 8 rather than the original age groups to ensure we met the sample size for an adequately powered study. And we also changed the procedure, so rather than the child completing the task on a tablet with just the experimenter present, the task would be completed over Zoom on a laptop or a computer with a guardian present as well. So these are some of the main obstacles we encountered, so practicality and safety, recruitment and accessibility, engagement and interference, and standardization and reliability. So in terms of practicality, we had to consider if what we wanted to do was feasible online and what parameters could change. Fortunately, we were able to go ahead with the original task we designed. We just had to figure out how to host it online. So we spent a lot of time exploring what platforms and softwares were available. We needed one that would let participants share their screen, share their video, and let us record at the same time. So we found that Zoom had the best features for us. Once we'd established that, we had to decide which devices we were able to run Zoom on with those features, which I initially didn't think of, but fortunately during the pilot testing, we did realise that tablets and phones wouldn't be able to be used for the testing because they didn't allow participants to share their screen and their video at the same time. And then in terms of safety, we had to ensure that the platform was safe and secure, so we made sure all meetings were password protected. In terms of ethical issues, we encountered various ethical issues. One of the more prominent ones was we had to ensure that we had the child's full consent before starting. So when we planned to recruit in schools, we'd hoped that they would have the study explained to them by a teacher or by one of the research assistants going in to explain it to them as a class, so they'd all have heard the same information in the same way. So to combat this, we would run through a list of questions to ensure the children knew what they would be doing and that they were happy to do it. And then we'd obtain their verbal assent on camera before starting the experiment. And then adults being present meant that we had to have their consent to be recorded as well. So our informed consent was extensive to make sure all involved were covered. And this also meant ensuring that nobody walked into the camera frame during the experiment. And then the experiment taking place in the child's home meant that we had to consider what we would do if we were unfortunately witnessed an abusive situation. So we designed a child safety protocol which involved reporting the incident to the PI if anything were to happen. And then the experiment being online also meant there were extra layers added to the data handling process, which was difficult because obviously the data was very sensitive. We were handling recordings of children. So the videos couldn't be saved directly to the secure data share as originally planned. So we worked closely with IT and the ethics team to add a third safe step, which involved uploading them to a secure data share cloud and then transferring them to the data share via remote desktop immediately after recording. And then in terms of recruitment, so we were aware that parents might be more wary of online experiments, despite it being a university-run and approved study. We were aware that some parents might rule it out before seeing this. So one thing we found really helpful was having a web page on the lab website for the experiment and linking that on the adverts for parents to see. So for providing any links to websites to verify the work and its affiliation to the university was super useful. And then since the experiment involved children, I found short and simple adverts got more attention because it was easier for the adult to explain to the child what they could take part in and what they'd be doing. And I think this is less labour on their part because they weren't having to simplify an in-depth advert. I did try the technical science way of explaining the research and it got no engagement, so short and simple was definitely better. And then I also found making a poster was helpful as it provided a visual for the children to look at whilst also having the important information for the adults. I also played around with the wording and decided that playing up the fun side of the experiment was definitely better. So calling it a fun quiz rather than like a memory experiment and saying it would be a good activity during lockdown, which I think definitely appealed to the parents, especially as this specific study was run during the first lockdown. So I think parents were struggling to find things for their children to do. And then obviously having the prize incentive clearly stated. So we had £10 Amazon vouchers for each child who took part. And then in terms of accessibility, so with the changing recruitment, we had a lot of changes in accessibility. I was aware that some adults might not have access to social media, which we really capitalised on to recruit and advertise the study. And I personally hadn't heard of a lot of the websites and platforms we ended up using to recruit. So one idea we did have was to utilise a space in the community around us to reach out to those who didn't have online access. I just want to know that we didn't actually end up doing this. We had planned to do this, but by the time I'd had the posters printed, we'd met our sample size. But it could be useful to have posters put up on notice boards in GPs or local shops and just places that are still accessible during lockdown, just in case there are people who don't have online access. Obviously, if you have the ethical approval for this. And the experiment, because of this, the experiment became more limiting because some people didn't have, the experiment had to be run on a laptop or a computer because we needed a mouse for the adult to do the clicking, and it had to visually be big enough to see the items involved in the task. So we were aware it might take longer to reach our sample size. And we also found it was useful to send a reminder out of which devices can be used just before starting the experiment. So if I had a session arranged with a participant, I would send out a reminder just to say, just to let you know, we can't run this experiment on iPads or phones because occasionally we would have participants turning up on an iPad or a phone. And then I'd have to rearrange for them again when they had access to a laptop or a computer. So that was definitely useful. And then there were occasions where Wi-Fi connection would be too poor to continue. So adding to the instruction pack a note to encourage participants to connect to their Ethernet cable if possible, or rearranging for a time when there's less internet traffic was also useful. But unfortunately, this just was one of the caveats of running it online. And if the connection was too bad to continue, we couldn't have them participate, unfortunately. So we were also conscious that we might have a higher exclusion rate if the visual quality of the experiment was too difficult to code. And then in terms of engagement, engagement was really difficult over Zoom. So with the distractions of their home environment and the addition of the guardian being present, it was hard work keeping the kids' attention, especially because it was quite a long task as well. So I found changing my voice really helped in keeping their attention to just, you know, sounding really enthusiastic and sounding like I was having fun, so they would hopefully have fun. And then I also found frequent encouragement really helped keep them motivated. And this was really evident in the kids because you could tell they enjoyed hearing that they were doing a good job. And then just frequent check-ins to make sure they were feeling okay and make sure they were attending to the task. I definitely did these two things more than I would have done if the experiment had been in person, but I was careful not to do it too much and just to ensure I didn't influence their decisions or their performance. And then in terms of motivation, we had a prize incentive. So we made sure to add mention of this into the instructions. So we'd say how their performance could affect their prize. And we also thought it was useful to consider the optimum testing time for children this age. And we did this by asking the parents to suggest a time that they thought their child would perform best or be best prepared for the task. And this definitely helped the children kind of engage and be motivated when they were doing the task. But we also found it helpful to be prepared for a high number of unfinished experiments as a precautionary. And then in terms of interference, so originally it would have been just the experimenter and the child, but an adult had to be present for safety and to do the clicking. So one thing we found useful was to send out the instruction pack to them beforehand with all the instructions and detailing them to try not to interfere and to reiterate this during the experiment. One benefit of having the adult present was that it opened up an opportunity for children to use another metacognitive measure, which is looking to caregiver, which was really exciting. And then having my camera on or off. So I started with my camera on, but found that children would become shy and some would even refuse to take part if they could see me. So I decided it was better for me to have my camera off. But I think this is definitely useful to think about, although there's caveats to both. So children might be less engaged if they think that the experiment is no longer present and feel less inclined or motivated to finish the experiment. And we would recommend that they be somewhere quiet without interruption to finish the experiment, although we were also aware that they have other commitments at home in the home environment and might not be able to do this. So just being flexible with my schedule and offering to do weekends if it meant the adult had more support at home to take time to do the quiz with the child. And then for standardization, we had to account for new biases once moving online. So once we'd established that we could only use laptops and computers, we had to take into account a clicking bias. So older children would probably be able to use a mouse better than younger children and be able to click their answers faster. So this was important as we were measuring reaction time. So we decided the best way to tackle this was to have children point at the answers instead and code that as reaction time. And then reading bias was another issue. So having the questions written on screen meant that children who were more adept at reading could answer quicker. So we decided to have the experimenter read out the question to combat this. And then we also asked adults to return their mouse to the top of the screen, to like a little mouse house. So they didn't unconsciously hover the mouse over the answers and influence a child's decision. Although we found this didn't really work. And I found that reminding the adults to do this just meant more interruptions of the child. And then setup was also important for subsequent coding. So we found it really helpful to like make a diagram of the desired setup and to send this out beforehand, and then to check we were happy with the setup before continuing. And then in terms of reliability, sorry, I'm aware I'm going over time a bit, but I'm almost done. So if a child did start clicking, I found it helpful to remind them with motivation. So I'd say, you know, would you mind if the adult did the clicking, because I really need to see how good you are at pointing. And then if there were multiple children in one family doing the quiz, we had to ensure that they were not in the same room whilst their siblings did it. And then for experimental consistency, we did choose to use one experimenter to try and retain some of the consistency, as we weren't sure how it was going to run online. Most of the issues we did find were in hindsight or discovered by trial and error. So I think having a single experimenter carrying it out made monitoring these and fixing these issues more manageable. And we were lucky in that the relatively small sample size meant that this was feasible, but I'm aware that having a larger sample size might make this more difficult. But yeah, that's it. So if anyone has any questions, that'd be great. So, and I also have these discussion points if anybody would like to know more about these. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Maddie. So again, I'm sure everybody will join me in saying thank you. That was super, super interesting. And we really, really appreciate it. I'm sure some people might have other meetings to go to at 1. So
yeah, sorry, I ran over a little bit.
No, it's not your fault, Maddie. I think each of us in turn got a bit excited as well. So it's not just you. But I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everybody for joining us. If you do need to pop off now, but we will stay on and do some questions for Maddie if people do have questions. But just wanted to say a massive, massive thank you to the 4 speakers and to everyone for joining if people do need to leave. So Maddie, you have got a few questions.
Hey,
so
awesome.
we have a question from Sarah that asks, how did you deal with extensive parental interference?
So I would just reiterate to the parents to try and refrain from helping a child, which I did. I felt for them because it was difficult I can understand it was difficult for the parent to see their child not performing well in something. So I guess it's kind of an implicit bias for them to want to help. But I would say to them, would you mind, letting your child answer the questions themselves? And then if there was persistent interference, we would have to unfortunately exclude those specific trials from the data set. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then we've got another question from Maria saying, hi Maddie, can you give me more detail of what the child safety protocol entailed?
So fortunately we never had to use it, but I believe it involved if something were to happen, we would inform the parents or the guardian that the experiment would no longer be going ahead, and we would quit the browser, and then we would get in contact with the PI to detail what happened. And then the PI would manage it from there.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another question from Julie saying, fabulous talk, Maddie. And how did you measure reaction time exactly? And could you see when and where the child was pointing to?
So this was difficult. So ideally we did want the clicking to be how we measured reaction time, but because of the clicking bias, we did choose to do the pointing. We tried to have the child's torso and arms in shot, but if that wasn't possible, and sometimes, the camera would be angled so you couldn't see where the child's hand was pointing. So when we were explaining to the RAs and the coders, we would say, if you can see the child's shoulder moving, like at the hinge of the arm, and they subsequently say this one, you can kind of guess when they have pointed at the answer and chosen the answer. And a lot of the children, thankfully, would use vocal cues as well to signify they'd chosen an answer. So if you couldn't see the arm, but you could see the shoulder movement, and then they'd say, I choose that one. That's how we would recommend coding the reaction time. But it was difficult because a lot of the time the webcam wasn't kind of ideally positioned to see the arm of the pointing. So yeah. Thank you for the question.
Fantastic. And we have another question from Anushka. Did you find children seeking any non-verbal parental approval before they gave their responses, like gazing towards the parent?
Yes. So I did observe the children looking at the parents quite a lot, or the caregiver quite a lot, before giving their answers, and the parent would subsequently say, don't look at me, I can't help, I don't know the answer. But we didn't actually find it was a significant predictor in accuracy, which is really interesting. So just by eye, it looks like they were using that non-verbal gesture quite a lot. But yeah, when we looked at the analysis, it wasn't a significant predictor of accuracy. Thank you for the question.
And I'm not sure if you have any further questions, Maddie. If they do keep popping up in the chat, I'll read them for you. But if not, I'm not sure if you want to just take us home.
Yeah, so thank you everyone so much for coming. We've really enjoyed doing this and having these discussions, and I hope you found it as interesting as we have. I just wanted to thank all the speakers for being here today and taking the time to share their experiences. And also a massive thank you to all those involved with organising this, so Heather, Jet, Jasmine, Right to Time, and everyone else. It's been a really great idea, and I've personally found it really helpful to reflect on what I've done and to hear everyone else's experiences. So thank you. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email us. But yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you. I know that some of the speakers are happy to stick around if anybody has any further questions, or if you want me to pass on emails, I can. But thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, everybody.